I want to prove to you that as an indie dev, your creativity and ideas are more important than your coding abilities. Welcome, I'm Brandon, and my wife Nikki and I make videos about all things game dev. We hope you enjoy. A little over a year into development of our commercial project, Veil of Maia, Nikki and I decided to take a small detour from that project because it felt like we were spinning our wheels a little bit. And working on something smaller and more immediate sounded like a good way to boost our motivation and hopefully, honestly, boost our bank account a little bit. And this is where we came up with a ridiculous idea, a 90-day game challenge. And we hope to release this in just a few short months, so wishlist it, it's gonna be awesome. I say it's ridiculous because 90 days is just short enough to feel like the deadline is impossibly close, and also just long enough to make us overscope all of our ideas a little bit. So you kind of get the worst of both worlds there. But being this rushed, while I don't necessarily like it, it has forced me to approach the creation of this game in a whole new way. I have strong perfectionism problems, and so what I tend to want is this nice clean list of to-do items where I cross them off one by one in a nice linear orderly fashion. Nikki gives me art goes into the game engine, and I program the functionality that makes that art come to life. Add polish, and then I'm done with that to-do item. That to-do item is crossed off and I never need to touch it again. But that's not always how things are done, and that's not always how the world works. Look at this screenshot. Nikki was busy editing our devlog, and so I had to go ahead and plow ahead without art. Don't know if you can tell, but this brown turd in the hallway, that's actually a chest. I struggle with things not being done in a linear way. And this perfectionism of mine extends especially into my code. I came into game development with zero programming experience. So the biggest hurdle for me when I was a beginner was programming. And when I was new, I had this thought of, if I can just get good enough to be able to do anything without help, then I'll be unstoppable. And interestingly, I've kind of reached that point now. I'm at the point where I can basically figure out how to code whatever it is that I need to code. And yet on a lot of levels, I still very much feel like I'm still a beginner. And actually, I'm really curious, comment down below if you feel that way as well, because maybe I'm alone here, but maybe you guys feel the same way as well. But through working on Samurado, I'm starting to see why I never feel like I've leveled up in my experience. By the way, really quick, if you want to play Samurado, or Veil of Maia for that matter, you can today. Every single month on Patreon, we upload an alpha build of our game. So if you want to play those games and see behind the scenes exclusive content, then you can do so by supporting us on Patreon. The world of programming is filled with a lot of design guidelines, and those guidelines can really start to feel like rules that you are supposed to follow. And somehow throughout my development journey, I got this message sunk into my head that if I'm not following those guidelines, if I'm not doing everything perfectly, then somehow I'm doing it wrong. Don't nest more than 3 levels deep. Don't repeat or duplicate code. Rely on abstraction rather than concrete implementations. A client should never be forced to depend on methods that it doesn't use. Keep your classes open for extension but closed for modification. Decouple your visuals from your logic. Blah, blah, blah. There are dozens and dozens of guidelines/rules like this. But I'm here to tell you, these are not rules. There are no absolutes with this stuff, especially when you are an indie developer and you are making a game by yourself and no one else is ever going to see your code. And because the development of Samurado has been so rushed, I have not had time to get stuck in my head about all of these rules. I just got to keep making stuff. So that is why this project has been so immensely helpful for me. Now, it is worth mentioning that every single guideline I just listed to you, they are all actually very helpful guidelines. They can help you write better code, and I'm actually thinking of making a video on the solid principles in the future. Maybe, we'll see. So I'm not saying to ignore those guidelines, but if you try to follow all of those guidelines for no other reason than you're supposed to, it can just take all of your creative energy and make it bend in on itself, and it just becomes a huge mess, and you'll end up stuck. There is a time and a place for these guidelines, for the solid principles, for all of these programming rules and guidelines that you've heard about. They are there to help keep your code more scalable and more maintainable, and they can absolutely save you time. For example, when I was less experienced, let's say I wanted to make an interactable object in my game, let's say a chest. I would set up a whole script for the functionality around that chest, and you would get near the chest and a little pop-up message would show up that would say open chest, and if you press the E key, the chest would open and all of the treasure would spill out at you. But then if I wanted to make a door or a lever or be able to pick up an object or have any other interactable object in the game, I would have to do all of that coding again from scratch, from the ground up. And that is a case where abstraction would have saved me heaps and heaps of time. You can use the same base for every interactable object in your game and then just add little pieces on top of it. But if you don't do it that way, that does not mean you're doing it wrong. It just means you did it inefficiently. There are some things with your code that if they work, you can leave them alone and move on to new things. Not everything needs to be refactored and perfected to death. If you are making a video game, putting your ego aside is going to help you immensely. Forget about being perfect, forget about making your code impressive. Instead, take all of that energy that you're putting towards your code and use it to give your players the experience that you want them to have. And how can you best deliver that experience to your players? That takes design skills, not programming skills. Code is there to do a job in your game. Many jobs. There are efficient ways of writing code and there are inefficient ways of writing code. You will learn the efficient methods over time as long as you're open to learning new things. I promise you, it is impossible not to get better the more that you do this. But for right now, if it works and your players are enjoying the experience that you crafted for them, that's enough. If you are an indie developer, among other things, you are a marketer, a tester, an entrepreneur, an artist, an animator, a programmer, and a designer. You are not just one thing. Reading design books will help you more than reading programming books. Programming is just a tool to help you bring your design decisions to life. If you're a good programmer, then you're probably faster than someone who is a bad programmer. If you're a bad programmer, then maybe you take longer. Maybe you need to re-optimize some things down the road. But generally speaking, the end result for the user, your players, it's going to be the same. Here's how I look at it. If you program badly, you're doing yourself a disservice. If you design badly, you're doing all of your players a disservice. And we're here to figure out the best way to make fun video games for people to play and enjoy. So hopefully I've helped you zoom out from your code and be able to breathe just a little bit easier and help you focus more on what makes your game fun and how can you deliver that to people. Like the video if you liked. Bye, guys. I want to give a very special thank you to all of our Hall of Fame patrons, Jakob Bjonduk, Zondra Kessler, Darren Perrine, Throbbing Wind, Fontaine Waite, Couch, and Christopher Nichols, as well as our early access patrons, Sayoma, Ken Waite, and Mason Crow. If you choose to support us on Patreon, you can get early access to all of our YouTube videos, monthly alpha builds, and more.